So, hello everybody and welcome to this event of Brazil Week 2020. This is the 7th year that we are celebrating Brazil Week at King's College London, at Brazil Institute of King's College London. This year in particular, we are celebrating it in a very different way as all other events in the world, so nothing in particular doing that online anymore. We got used to that after the situations that we are all living globally. We also have another reason to be looking at this week in a special way, and that's a celebratory one. The year 2020, despite all difficulties that we face globally, we also were at King's and in Brazil Institute particularly celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Institute. So it's a big achievement to keep with an institute with this proportion for such a long time already, and really looking ahead and trying to see how the challenges of the future or the present also can be addressed by the work that we do at Brazil Institute. So I would like to thank you all to join us for this session today, to join us for Brazil Week this year, and particularly for this event today here. I was just talking to the two other speakers that we will have tonight, that the first event that I actually organized at King's College London in 2014, when I just arrived here, was a conference about peacekeeping operation. So we can see that it is a topic that we are looking very carefully and for quite a long time already at Brazil Institute. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Vinicius de Carvalho. I am Senior Lecturer for Brazilian Studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and Director of King's Brazil Institute since last September. Those who are familiar with the Institute know that the previous director was Professor Anthony Pereira, who not left the Institute. He's continuing working with us, but is not in the direction anymore. Since last September, I took this road, and yeah, that's the first Brazil Week that I am organizing as director of the Institute. So again, thank you very much for joining us here today. This event in particular that we are having here, it also represents a new achievement of Brazil Institute and another partnership in the way that we look how the Institute can be relevant for the world. Last year, in the end of last year, we celebrate an agreement or a partnership with REBRAPAZ, the Brazilian Network of Researchers in Peace Operation. This network, well established already in Brazil, has been contributing a lot for the debate and discussions and the studies on peacekeeping operations, and especially from the Brazilian perspective to peacekeeping operations. So we joined forces with REBRAPAZ last year, and this is the first event that we are putting together the two institutions. A first event of a series of several other events that we will host for the coming years, I hope. We will have today here the coordinator of the REBRAPAZ, Dr. Eduarda Hamann, and that will join us also with Ivo Werneck, directly from the United Nations in New York, to debate the leadership in peace operations and the Brazilian perspectives on that. You probably saw the announcement that we would be, the chair of this event would be Dr. Kieran Meaton from the Department of War Studies. He had some unforeseen circumstances today and could not be with us. So what I will be doing is I will be moderating or chairing this debate, organizing the round table here, chairing the questions and debates that we have after the presentations. And also in the end, I will do a sort of putting together of the ideas that we have here. How it will work, our seminar today. We will start in a few minutes with a short video recorded by our Vice Principal International, Professor Funmi Olonisakin, who have been working with peacekeeping operations also for quite a long time in the spectrum of the United Nations peacekeeping operations. So a well-versed person, an important scholar in this topic that will give some perspectives to us about what are the challenges of leadership for peace operations nowadays and for the future. After that, we will have Ivo Werneck coming and making his presentation about the perspectives of United Nations for peace operations, for leadership in peace operations. And immediately after, Eduarda Hamann will join us and discuss the contributions that Brazil can give for this aspect of leadership in peace operations. Then you probably can see, and you are probably familiar already with Zoom very well, you have a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, you can write down your questions there, and we'll be, in the moment of the Q&A, addressing those questions. So again, thank you very much for joining us. And I will share with you right now my screen with the video recorded by Professor Funmi Olonisakin. I call the attention that many of the keywords, many of the topics that she's bringing in that video, it's what feed us to prepare these presentations also today for you. Thank you, and let's go.
Hello, I am Funmi Olonisakin, Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's College London. Now, in thinking about the challenges of leadership in peace operations, I suggest that we look beyond the very obvious focus, which is also important, on the actions of individuals in positions of authority, such as those leading, if you like, political institutions that authorize peace missions, the civilian and military components of peace missions that are also led by individuals. And I want to suggest that it is more rewarding to consider the larger context in which peace operations and the outcomes that they pose, they present for societies where the missions are deployed. Therefore, the perspective of leadership that we bring to bear often reveals much about the institutions, their limitations, and their strengths. Now refer to peace operations specifically. If we look at the larger context in which peace operations occur, if we take this into account, what we observe is a dysfunctionality in the leadership that defines the peace mission. Very often, we see a different picture. Let me offer some explanation in this regard by highlighting two leadership perspectives in relation to peace operations. The first is a position-based perspective, which places emphasis, if you like, on hierarchy of decision-making. We have typically seen peacekeeping through the eyes of a number of actors. And there are four in this regard. The first is the organization or institution which authorizes a peace operation, such as the United Nations through the Security Council, or regional organizations for that matter, when they mandate the peace operation. The second is at the level of member states, where we have troop contributing countries to a peace mission. The third is the host country itself, or shall I say the host environment, which consents to the peace mission. So in essence, this amounts to a state party or state parties or non-state parties that consent to an operation. Fourth and last is the peace operation itself, which is guided by that mandate from the authorizing body. In a UN mission, you would have that peace operation led by the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General, working with the force commander in charge of the military operation. But let's talk about another perspective. Whilst that chain of command should be obvious in the previous perspective, that the mandating authority has responsibility, bears overall responsibility, and is able to really hold the peace operation leadership to account. The second perspective is not a direct chain in that way. It's not directly, you find that people in the whole society are not directly connected, for example, to this hardware of peace, of the peace leadership architecture. But there is a relational dimension to it. There's a relationship in which people in the whole society that they have with peace operations, and they're meant to be the direct beneficiaries of the activities of the peace mission. but this relational element of leadership is not often apparent in the way we look at leadership of peace missions. That is what I want to focus on in trying to highlight the leadership challenge of peace operations that we often do not take direct account of. And this is an important software that holds the promise of stable peace, which may not always be the case. As I've argued elsewhere, the chain of actors in a peace operation will represent the distant beholders of peace, while the ordinary people who live through the horrors of war or the violence of conflict and are supposed to reap, if you like, the benefits of peace, they are seen as largely removed from that equation, from the formal architecture, but they are the local owners of peace. The actions of peace operations personnel can severely challenge the relationship between a local population, for example, and a peace operation. And to an extent, it also challenges the effectiveness of the chain of command of that peace operation. And that's the leadership dysfunctionality that poses a challenge and limits the success of peace missions. We have seen, for example, how the pursuit of accountability for peacekeepers who perpetuate sexual abuse reveals the dysfunctionality in the leadership infrastructure, which I outlined earlier, that chain of command from the mandating body all the way to the peace operation on the ground. The UN or a regional organization, for example, cannot successfully punish any military personnel of a troop contributing country. And that in itself is the crux of the matter that tells us what the core leadership challenges in peace operation. This twin challenge of, on the one hand, a faulty leadership infrastructure, and on the other, inadequate trust between the whole society and the peace mission is perhaps the most difficult leadership challenge that confronts peace operations. And I've been deliberate in not focusing on the traditional areas of command and control in the operation of the peace mission itself, or questions of logistics as part of the leadership challenge. I wanted to highlight this particular aspect, which is often left out in the literature, in practice, in considering what the leadership challenges are for peace operations. Thank you very much.
So if Funmi was here, we would be giving her a big applause and thanking her for her words here. I think what she said, what she just brought to us, are quite key important points that we should be looking very carefully. And that's what we intend to do in our debate here today, is this aspect of how to overpass, or actually hope to break this tendency of dysfunctionality of leadership in peace operation, and exactly think about these two aspects that she mentioned very clearly here: a position-based leadership and a relational dimension leadership. I think those 2 points are the key elements that we will be trying to look more carefully and more in details here now. Well, I will pass the word then for the first speaker that will be bringing us the perspective from the United Nations today. I will be not introducing each one of you reading your CVs. We can have that in the web page of the Institute and announcing our activities here. I think we can use the benefit of the internet today. While people are listening to us, they can check more details about each one of us in their web page. So Ivo, thanks again for joining us here, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Vinicius. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today and trying to contribute to the Brazil Week of King's College in London. I will share my screen now with you. Just a quick introduction. My name is Ivo Werneck. I work in the Strategic Force Generation Capability Planning Cell in the Department of Peace Operations. I will try to explain a little bit about the UN leadership requirements and characteristics, but I'll also try to focus a little bit on the military and the police side, because that's where I work and that's where my expertise are. At a certain point, I will also make some comments, which are my personal comments and do not reflect what the organization thinks. Okay, so let me try to share my screen so we can have something to base our conversation. I hope you all can see it now. Okay, so roundtable on leadership in UN peace operations, challenges and opportunities for Brazil. Before we go straight to Brazil, let's have an overview of what we currently consider as senior posts that require leadership characteristics. Right, so these are the questions that we have. We're going to go on all three of them. First thing I would like to mention is what was the work of the fourth generation service inside the Office of Military Affairs in the year 2020? We were responsible to generate 71 senior leaders, military leaders, 1,912 staff officers, and 1,064 United Nations military experts on missions. Right? This is a very extensive work for a very small group, about 15 people doing all this. What I would like to highlight here in this slide is that when we talk about senior leaders in peace operations, we usually think about force commanders, deputy force commanders. But in reality, we are trying to be more criterious and be more focused when we select posts that require leadership that have an impact on performance and the outcome of the mission. So just a quick breakdown of some of these posts, that the 71 posts that we did last year. It says 73 because who were actually selected after this presentation was made to the C34, the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations. So I just showed the ones that we know: Chief Military Liaison Officer, we have Chief Military Observer, Deputy Chief of Staff, Deputy Force Commander, Force Commander. But we also have other posts in our peacekeeping operations that do not go just for the selection interview. We also have contracted posts, people who are seconded to the United Nations and then become international civil servants for a period of time. And also we have some posts on our peacekeeping operations: sector commanders, Maritime Task Force Commander, Joint Task Force Commander. Some of these posts, they are nominated by the member state, and then they are validated in an interview by the Secretariat. And while we're doing this validation interview, we are looking to see not only in the professional background that that officer usually has, but also his or her leadership characteristics. Because we understand that if you put the wrong person to conduct the team that will be delivering the mandated tasks, this will be an issue for the outcome of a mission. So these are some opportunities that we have. Brazil usually focuses a lot on the top. I want to have the force commander, the deputy force commander, but there are other opportunities where a member state can contribute that are not at the general level. You can find a colonel or as someone from other branches at the same rank. Just as an idea, the process to hire somebody or to select somebody for senior posts, usually it takes around 6 months. So it's a nomination that comes from the member state. We expect the member state to also look into the job descriptions and nominate people who are actually qualified. Usually we have multiple member states nominating for one post, right? So not always the position is given to the country. It's a dispute between countries. It's a competition. There will be a short list based on the documents, the CV that is sent to the UN, a round of interviews. Then this is sent for leadership for decision, and then we have the outcome and the deploy to the mission. So in average, we take around 6 months to make selection of senior positions in our peacekeeping operations. As I mentioned, the UN, after the reform we had in 2018, also a resolution on performance, leadership became a key point, a key factor on effective performance of our peacekeeping operations. And when we talk about the leadership, it's not only about the military, It's also about the civilian. And we noticed, and member states noticed, that sometimes the selection of some of the civilian leadership wasn't following some of the ideal criteria. We were not having enough qualified people with enough knowledge of the UN to be put in some key posts that were responsible to manage, to guide, to coordinate our efforts on the ground, or sometimes even at headquarters. So the UN launched a new system for leadership framework, which is a call for action and a call for change, right? It shows that senior UN leaders have particular responsibilities, but leadership occurs in all levels and contexts. They define 8 major characteristics for UN leadership. One, it's norm-based. The UN has its rules, its regulations, its charter, and all of these have to be obeyed. So whenever somebody that comes to work as an international civil servant, you will not be applying your national rules, your national norms anymore. You'll be using what member states have agreed, and we have to follow as members of the United Nations. It's principled. These norms that we're talking about, they should be done regardless of who you're applying them to, regardless of any feedback that you might have for a third party. You have to be principled when exercising your duties. Inclusiveness. The United Nations do not discriminate. We should treat everyone equally in respect of its age, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, and etc. So we have to bring everybody on board, and that's one of the duties of the leaders. Accountability. So we saw in the speech that was mentioned earlier, leaders have to be accountable, not only within the system, but also with those that they are working for, right? So the beneficiaries of our actions on the field, we are also accountable to them. Multidimensional. I think that today we have several concepts like whole of government, interagency cooperation. So today, the United Nations, we don't work in silos. We work together. It's a multiplicity of abilities that are put together in synergy to be able to deliver what the mandates that the council has given us. So being multidimensional and able to work with different people, with different organizational culture or national cultures, that is something that we look for leaders as well. It's transformational. The leader has to understand that what we're doing has to have an outcome of a positive transformation on what we're trying to achieve. Collaborative. We do not work by ourselves. We work as a system and with other partners. We work with host nations. We work with regional partners. We work with other institutions, NGOs, for example. So we have to be collaborative in nature. Self-applied, right? All of these characteristics that we mentioned, there's no one that's going to be, that we don't need anyone to be enforcing that to our leader. The leader has to understand and apply those characteristics to him or herself. Now, let's talk a little bit about the military leadership characteristics. And this is something that we advertise to member states every 3 months. My cell releases a document called the Emerging Uniform Capability Requirements for UN Peacekeeping. And we always focus on individuals, leaders, staff officers, individual police officers, where we advertise to member states what we're looking for. What are the characteristics of the leadership of the staff that we need to be deployed for peacekeeping operations? So we face challenge in finding rapid deployable leaders who have mixed skills, and especially knowledge of the operating environment, political judgment, and physical and mental stamina. That's very important. Our leaders, our military and police leaders, they need to know what's going on with the UN, our doctrine, which is very characteristics, policies, practice, command and control authority. How do we use force? It's not always the way the UN apply force is not the same way we do in our national capacities. The role of police and military components within an integrated and multidimensional peacekeeping operation. Crisis management. Peacekeeping operations are always managing crisis, always having to mitigate some problems. And most importantly, protection of civilians. Most of our missions have the mandate to protect civilians, and we have to do it on the way that the organization has decided to do it. We need leaders that have relevant operational experience, training, and ethics. That also contributes to accountability. We have to have leaders with the proper mindset to navigate in the operational and political terrain of a multidimensional peacekeeping operation. We are not military components and police components are not operating by themselves. They are operating within a political framework to achieve an objective. So if you don't have a clear coordination, a clear line of efforts between these three pillars, the mission will not achieve its objectives, right? And it's important that men and women chosen by the member states serve also as contingent commanders. All these characteristics apply for national contingents when deployed with peacekeeping operations. I'm going to show now a brief job description for a force commander post. These are some of the minimum qualifications that we require from an officer applying for the force commander position. You need to have peacekeeping experience, preferably at senior military posts. Staff experience at division or brigade level, national staff college or war college, command experience at brigade or higher, excellent leadership and management skills, ability to foster teamwork, initiative and supervising staff, allowing staff to work, and resourcefulness, sound judgment, and decision-making skills. And all these are validated through a PHP analysis and then interviews. Let's go to Brazil now. Let's talk about the very recent past and how we were represented. Now we're going to an area where it's my personal opinion, my personal views, not what the organization has reflected. What the organization has reflected was up to now. So in 2015, for example, we had 5 senior leaders in peacekeeping operations or in peacekeeping activities. We had the force commander in MINUSTA, we had the force commander in MONUSCO, we have the maritime commander in the UNIFIL Maritime Task Force. We had the director of the Office of Peacekeeping Strategic Partnership, the DPKO, and we have 1 member in the high-level independent panel for peace operations. What do we have today? Today we have the force commander MONUSCO, who is about to leave the position in March 2021, and we still do not know if Brazil is going to be able to get that post. So we can see a decline in our representation at senior posts in peacekeeping operations. What do I see as opportunities for the? We have an excellent performance history, both in individual and in units contribution. Brazil has a record that shows that our performance is very good. So they know that when they look for a Brazilian officer to be in a post like that, it's a reliable, it's a credible option. Our officers have shown great flexibility and ability to work in diverse environments, which is a characteristic of UN operations. We are flexible, we are easy to blend in, and we do this naturally. We have strong knowledge of interagency operations and civil military relations at political and operational levels. We know how to work under political guidance. We know the role of the military. We know how to express ourselves and how to understand and convey our message to political leadership. Military officers from Brazil have a very solid education system and professional qualifications are given to him or her throughout the career, which make them solid candidates for future selection. Our history in terms of conduct and discipline and human rights records is exemplary. We have not had any issues with that, which also contributes to accountability, to our ability to not be blamed for any other in issues related to HR human rights screenings. So it's something that's in our favor. So the example that our officers give is very good. The neutrality. So most of the times we're deployed, Brazil doesn't have a national agenda, particular interest on that region or in that mission. And that sometimes is favorable for us because we understand that in big missions, when you have some countries contribute with a lot of units, they also have their interest in having posts. And sometimes this internal dispute, Brazil can come as an outsider and bring peace to that internal dispute. And One thing that's extremely interesting to see is that Brazilian military, they take pride in being part of the UN, being part of the UN peacekeeping operations. I have noticed some countries that sometimes want to contribute. They don't like using the blue beret. They don't like to use the UN colors. They ask for waivers not to be painted white. Brazil takes pride in being part of the UN. So these are some opportunities that I see that the country can use to project its intent for more posts, more positions. On the other hand, we also have challenges. The first one that I see is that our low number of troops in field missions. We currently have no units deployed. In 2014, we were among the top 20 contributors. Currently, we are the 68. And that might drop down, 68 out of 122. And if we lose the post as a force commander in MONUSCO, we'll be losing around 15 other personnel that are part of his staff. We also have had some problems with recent financial contributions. So it's very understandable that countries that contribute with troops and with money, they are looking also for positions that represent their countries in field missions. If you're not contributing, as we say, with blood or money, the chances of you being given some posts, it becomes a bit more limited. And the fact that we don't have units on the ground today has a longer term effect, because we will have a very few people with that experience at a higher level, at command experience in peacekeeping operations, later on apply for senior posts. We have few senior officers, as I mentioned, that have this ability, have the experience to be, had the chance to be in a peacekeeping operation, either commanding a unit or at a senior post in a headquarters. Sometimes our Brazilian colleagues, they do have a language problem at a professional level. They can communicate for leisure, but not for professional reasons, writing documents in English and or French. We have a lot of peacekeeping operations such as MINUSCA, MONUSCO, MINUSMA, that require French as an additional working language. And as part of our gender parity and the efforts that the Secretary is doing to increase the number of female officers deployed, due to our career progression and the inclusion of females within the military, not in the police, we have a few qualified, and when I mention qualified is because they haven't reached the rank and the experience within the career to apply for these senior posts. So that is another challenge that we have in trying to fulfill some of the Secretariat's agendas. So ladies and gentlemen, that's what I had to present. I'll be happy to take your questions at the end. And again, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, Vinicius.
Many thanks, Ivo, for this comprehensive approach and showing what are the demands today from the perspective of United Nations for leadership in missions, and also from your point of view and perspectives regarding what is the Brazilian possible contribution, and also the challenge that Brazil needs to face in order to be more active and present in these roles of leaders inside peacekeeping missions in the United Nations. You probably have already some questions coming in the Q&A box there. You can, if you want, also answer to them writing the answers, or if you want, we can keep them for the debate after. It depends on how you prefer to do that. I will pass now to Eduarda Hamann, the coordinator of the REBRAPAZ, the Brazilian Network for Research in Peace Operation. As I mentioned before, our recent partner with Brazil Institute. And Eduarda will discuss more again about her own perspective and the Brazilian, how she sees the contribution that Brazil can bring to this leadership role in United Nations peacekeeping operation. Eduarda is with you.
Thank you. Just trying to put my presentation here. Sorry, I have a double there. Well, thank you for doing this together. It's been really a pleasure to do all the planning of this first event organized by REBRAPAZ and King's Brazil Institute. I'm really happy to be here. It's an honor to be here with you today. And I'd like to share the initial findings of a new research of mine, hoping that I could get some insights from the audience and perhaps even inaugurate a new research agenda in Brazil on this subject of leadership. And my presentation is divided into two sections. So I'll share a couple of thoughts on what I thought the UN needs in terms of leadership, and it's a pleasure to do it after Mr. Werneck has covered so much. So thank you for doing that. But I also have one slide on that just to build my argument, and then I also try to see how the UN finds their leaders. And then I'll move to my second section, which is longer, and to think about, okay, we know what the UN needs. Let's look at the other side, what member states can offer in terms of leadership and what Brazil is actually offering in terms of leadership. So what kind of leaders is the UN looking for? Mr. Werneck, as I mentioned, has already covered much of that, but I keep on thinking, how do the UN does the UN find them? How the UN would populate an organogram of a mission, of DPO even, you know, and so on. And if you look at human resources of the UN, which is complex, and I'll make it short here, you basically have, as highlighted, you have senior leaders who, as mentioned, would be presented or indicated by member states, and would be, their indication would be validated by the UN through an interview. But you also have mid-level staff, as I'm calling, which would eventually become leaders as well. And I raise this because I'm particularly interested in this approach, in this human resources approach of competence, and how it relates to our conversation on leadership. And what is competence? It is usually a combination of knowledge, skills, and attitude and values. So knowledge is what you know, and you gain this through formal or informal education. You learn about UN doctrine on peace, on peacekeeping. You learn about protection of civilians, as Mr. Werneck mentioned. You learn about women, peace, and security, and so on. And the skills is how to do something. So you know how to work with groups, you know how to speak a language, you know how to write a report, you know how to drive, you know how to shoot. And then attitude and values, these are more complex and more ample, but these include, for example, leadership, ethics, as mentioned, integrity, responsibility, honesty, camaraderie, and so on. My argument is that knowledge and skills can be developed through blue training, but attitudes and values they depend on a longer process of internalization developed throughout years, provided by green training. And then I use this image of an iceberg. The blue training is on the top. It is what allows a peacekeeper to wear the blue helmet. But when it comes to successful leadership, if you qualify leadership, successful leadership, then we must look deeper. And that's what I'm going to try to do. What Brazil has to offer. Now let's pause for a moment and let's look at what Brazil has to offer. I'll begin by looking at the outcome, at what Brazil has already been offering to the UN system throughout more than 70 years, since 1940s. So what's a summary of Brazil's participation in UN mission? I'm going to share some data with you. So throughout more than 70 years, as I mentioned, Brazil has deployed about 50,000 people, and most of them in one single mission, MINUSTA. And I'll get back to that in a moment. Brazil also took part in 50 UN missions, 45 of them being peacekeeping missions. So I'm here excluding Intermor, for example, which was a UN mission, but not a peacekeeping mission. UNSCOD, for example, which was not a peacekeeping mission, and others. If you disaggregate these 45 peacekeeping missions, then you have 8 missions with troops, Brazilian troops, which were deployed in strategic places for Brazil, for its Brazilian foreign policy, such as Angola, Mozambique, Haiti, Lebanon, Timor-Leste. And then you also have 37 peacekeeping missions with individuals, which is 74% of all the missions that have ever received Brazilians. And today, Brazilian nationals are in 8 out of the 13 active missions, all of them individuals, no troops, as mentioned. So this is a snapshot of Brazil's participation in UN mission. I did it when I was working for the Igarapé Institute, and I was fortunate enough to update it until the end of 2020. So this is everything from 1947 to 2020 in one single picture. And I'll go back to this graph for a moment, but basically you can see large circles that represent the missions with largest contingents. And you see several small circles representing the missions with individuals. And I'll now separate collective missions from individual missions. Let's look at the graphic again and consider this mission here, MINUSTA, which is up to now the most important UN mission for Brazil. It was active for 13 and a half years. It had 13 force commanders from Brazil. And Brazil is the country, as recent research has shown, that has sent most force commanders ever in UN history. And it also had this mission specifically, more than 37,000 military. They were in the island for together with 26 contingents. I'm going to go into the details of the contingents just because I know that Brazilian researchers, Brazilian academics, they don't understand that, or they don't dig deep enough, and that's what I'm trying to do. And so I try to understand how these contingents were organized in order to go deeper and deeper and find the leaders, find commanders and chiefs, and find the leaders. So how they were organized, basically there were one battalion from the army, like 800 more or less, I'm going to show you in a minute, an engineering company that would vary from 115 to 215, and then a company from the Navy. We also deployed a second battalion after the earthquake, but I'm not going to get into that. Let's look at this battalion, this main military units that I mentioned. Again, I'm looking for the leaders. I'm disaggregating all the data so I can find the leaders. And if you look at the first battalion, this is what you see in terms of number of people between 2004 and 2017 in Brabat 1, as we mentioned, okay? Only the battalion. And I took one battalion randomly. Again, I wanna go deeper to find the leaders. I wanna understand where they are, you know, how many they are, and where they were in the structure, and where they came from, and what kind of preparation they received before going to the mission. So I took this battalion, the 8th battalion, which had 821 people. And this was the composition of this battalion. It is, I was looking for leadership again, so I disaggregated these numbers by rank to find the commanders and the chiefs. This structure is in a pyramid shape, as you can see, and it's quite obvious for those who are familiar with the traditional military institutions, but it is not so obvious for Brazilian academic. And why am I showing you this? Because I want to get into this, which is the structure of a battalion. And it shows how it is organized and who commands who or what. I changed the color so it will be easier to understand, but basically commanders and chiefs are in blue, purple, and green. These are officers and sergeants. And going back to the numbers, the 37,000 that we had in the pyramid that I just showed, after disaggregating the data, you can easily argue that only like 20% of all the military deployed in MINUSTA, and probably in the other troops, I'd need to do more research to that, but only about 20%, perhaps 30% were commanders or chiefs. And all of them, at least in MINUSTA, went to military academies throughout their careers. Now let's look at individual missions. I'm going to go back to that point of the argument in a minute. Let me just add individual missions so we can work together with collective and individual missions and then arrive at the key point of my argument. When it comes to individual missions, of course, Mr. Werneck went into deeper details on that, but what I've been seeing in doctrine is that these are the posts currently available for in individual missions, at least the ones that the Brazilian doctrine, the Ministry of Defense is working with. So there are actually 5 categories: military observers, military advisors, liaison officers, staff officers, and secondments. And here you include, for example, force commanders, those who are contracted by the UN, as mentioned in the previous presentation. Going back to our graphic and looking specifically at individual missions, I have highlighted some of the missions that counted with Brazilians in individual missions. The first one ever was this one in New Guinea as a military observer. And then you also had military observers in more recent missions such as UNPROFOR or MINURSO in Western Sahara. You also have staff officer in a mission where we also have troops, for example, in Angola, UNAVEM3, or in MINUSTA, of course, you also have staff officers, and then a liaison officer we had in Timor-Leste, for example, a military advisor we had in MINUSCA, and we even got some awards for that. I'll come that in a minute. And of course, force commanders we had in MINUSTA and in MONUSCO. Further research is needed, but I can already share that officers who went to four different missions that I talked to, which are UNPROFOR, MINUSTA in Haiti, MINURSO, Western Sahara, and MINUSCA, Central African Republic, they said that within like a month or 2 in the field, they would already receive like more relevant and leading functions. They somehow would stand out among their peers, and they would quickly move from team members to team leaders. Why? So more research is needed, but I have a guess, I have a hypothesis, and that's what I'm gonna share with you. Before doing that, let's continue to look at the evolution of Brazil's participation with individuals. For the first 50 years, so from the 40s to the 90s, we only deployed military observers. These are data from the Ministry of Defense. After the mid-90s, we started deploying 4 categories: MILOBs, MILADs, liaison officers, and staff officers. The 21st century, these are the team leaders versus team members that I just mentioned. And you can actually see that in the 90s still. In the 21st century, it's quite interesting. So we're talking about only the last 2 decades or even less. We kept on deploying the 4 categories, but we added 3 more layers in our contributions to the UN peace and security system as a whole, which are force commanders, what I call strategic leadership in the field, sharing knowledge with other nations through training and mobile training units and so on and so forth, and also contributions to UN doctrine and strategic planning in New York. Some of these were mentioned by Mr. Werneck, and I'm gonna get that in a minute. This is a picture. These are some pictures from the last 15 years, so less than 2 decades, Brazil has had this kind of outcome. And as I mentioned, Brazil has had more force commanders in the UN than any other country. So we had 13 force commanders in MINUSTA, 3 in MONUSCO, 10 maritime task force commanders in UNIFIL, and 2 military gender advocate awards in the last 2 years. Now I'm getting to my argument and going back to the iceberg, which is about preparation. Above the surface, you have a short-term training required by the UN from materials developed by the DPO, the FS, in order to standardize knowledge and skills among TCCs and PCCs, of course. And Brazil currently has 2 peacekeeping training centers, one linked to the Ministry of Defense, commanded by the Army, and one related to naval operations. Both provide blue training for troops and individuals, and some of the courses have received training recognition by the UN. But in order to find the roots of a successful leadership, according to my research or what I found so far, and I'm almost finishing, Dr. Vinicius, you have to go beneath the surface. And that's my hypothesis. You have to go deeper. You have to look at the military education. And although it may sound obvious for Brazilian military, it is new to Brazilian researchers, and it could really become a new research agenda. We need to discuss military education. We need to go to military academies. We need to understand how they forge leaders for Brazil. And most importantly, we need to understand how they develop attitudes and values that are useful, not only for Brazil, but also for the UN. And I included some of the values that we find in the Brazilian Military Academy, those that are shown here in my presentation. So the preliminary conclusions, and with this I finish, is that leadership is key aspect for success or for failure, as just mentioned by Mr. Werneck and elsewhere. And this is true anywhere, including in UN peace operations, of course. Another thing is could be said that you shouldn't take leadership for granted. It's not built overnight. It takes years, even decades, to be developed. And more research is needed. And I do hope this becomes the research agenda of more groups in Brazil. But up to now, I can conclude that Brazilian uniformed personnel can contribute and is already contributing by successfully leading troops and teams. And finally, the UN is harvesting dates. So preparing leaders for so long that the UN can harvest eventually years later. Thank you. I'm open to questions, to suggestions so I can continue my research, and I appreciate your patience and thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for your presentation. You also have some questions already in the Q&A box there. If you want to answer that typing, it's okay. If you prefer to discuss that, also fine. Well, I should also bring some words before we open the floor to a broader discussion here and bring in my perspective on this matter. I think both aspects that we saw here, the Ivo presentation in which he highlighted the demands, more the demands of UN for what is a leadership, and Eduardo showing more how Brazil has been in some way preparing or seeding possibilities to have a more important role in leadership in United Nations peacekeeping operation. I will bring that together to one word that came from Funmi's presentation when she talks about the relational dimension of leadership. I think what we are seeing more and more in UN peacekeeping operations, and we start to see that very obviously during the MINUSTAH, and that it showed this complexity after MINUSTAH for Brazilians particularly, it's to understand that United Nations peacekeeping operations, they were not anymore a simple task related to having troops there and to having troops behaving simply, or a military leader, making these troops simply behave as troops in a standard or in a traditional military perspective. And the multidimensionality of peacekeeping operations required some flexibility of their leaders that could be only achieved through this relational aspect, through this to this perspective that there are several leaderships occurring at the same time during a mission. And one of those most important leaderships are the locals, are the local agency, those who we tend to look as victims of conflicts, but as Funmi highlighted also, they are actors, and they are those who will stay there when this mission is finished, and they are those who should be the ones responsible to rebuild or their country, or to consubstantiate or assure a continuous peace process to allow development. I'm sorry for coughing, but I'm still recovering from COVID here. So I think this dimensional aspect is very important here. And this dialogal aspect is the biggest challenge that we should try to look in the future of leadership of peace operations. What we have seen in this aspect, and what Eduardo showed us, is that for many years, Brazil is not only contributing with force commanders or troop contributing country like we did in MINUSTAH, but also build up in several levels of this leadership skills that can be or should be important for future development in peacekeeping operations. One of those aspects that Eduardo highlighted, and I would like also to call the attention for, is the aspect of training, is the aspect of incorporating the idea of one skill that is required from a soldier is the possibility of become a peacekeeper. So what that's interesting is how much the doctrine of the armed forces, how much the centers for doctrine, how much the manuals were created in order to prepare troops, regular troops, for the possibility of a peacekeeping deployment. How much that became part of the understanding and the formation of leaders from the military academies. No? So the fact that for 13 years, many Brazilian military have been to a peacekeeping operation in Haiti, they are coming back and creating this ethos inside the military that, yeah, we can be part of peacekeeping operation and we should be trained for that. That's not everywhere that we see this. And here we have, of course, some dangers. We have some borderlines that we should look very carefully to it. One of those borderlines is, why do we need an army in a country? No, it's an army simply for do peacekeeping operations. We know that some countries use that quite a lot to keep busy their troops, basically. But why we need an army in a country? Yeah, that's an important question that we should ask. And what's the role of the participation in peacekeeping operations for that armed forces? Is that the goal of anyone who joined the military? What's perceived that point? I think that's a crucial element here. Because of course it's very important to have this ethos, and that is the contribution, as Ivo mentioned, you know, this aspect of the pride of Brazilians to be part of peacekeeping operation. That's a very important element, but how much that is understood as a country contribution and not only a military capacity or capability. That's the second aspect that I would like to highlight here, is that to participate in peacekeeping operations, it's not simply deploy military to there, even in leadership position. There is a very important element of international relations, of foreign policy here. It's a country that engage in a peacekeeping operation. It's not simply a group of soldiers or leaders. It's a country that's taking part in that. So it's very important that this understanding of leadership in peacekeeping operation is not detached from the sense of what's the role of this country in the world. So that's I think is a very important point that we cannot lose in the context of Brazil. Brazil historically has played a role in the world, in the peace solution of conflicts, as a mediator, as a country that promote peace constitutionally speaking. So that these two things should work together: the military engagement and the international relations, or the understanding of the role of the country in the world. And that's the way of, I think, make a more proactive leadership presence in peacekeeping operations. That again will be not only translated in force commanders. Of course, that's an important element, and we have seen how much Brazil has done in recent years in this matter, but is reflected also in the participation of civilians in the spectrum of peacekeeping operations. So one aspect that Brazil still has a lot to develop is the engagement of civilians in the peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping are not only for troops in uniform. The missions, they are complex, they are multidimensional. Also the aspect of the police forces that normally is quite neglected in the Brazilian perspective of participation in peacekeeping operation. It's very small still, the participation of police forces in peacekeeping operations. And another aspect that I think that's indeed a great contribution of Brazil for peacekeeping operation in the moment that we are living now is this aspect of gender. No? Eduardo showed that two former members of individual missions, they were awarded by their work related to gender in peacekeeping operation. That's a very relevant challenge for peace operations currently. And Brazil has showed that even with a small participation of women in those peace operations, their participation represented something quite strong and original that made some difference in this relational dimension of leadership in peace operation. So what we can see here is that in the same time that Brazil is reducing its troops or has reduced its troops participation or troops contributing, currently there are quite a lot of aspects related to leadership, and again, not only understood as a force commander, but leadership in the spectrum of this term, in the relational dimension of this term, inside a spectrum of peace operations that we cannot neglect it and must be more explored, both academically, but also in the point of view of the practice of peacekeeping operations. Yeah, that would be the general ideas that I would like to bring here. And I think the most interesting aspect would be bringing to the floor, to the audience, and see the questions that we have here. I can see that some of these questions have been already answered by Ivo. We have some to Eduarda. So I would like to invite Eduarda and Ivo to come back to the stage, and we can start to go for these questions here. Eduarda, I have a first one for you here. It's Enrique Garbino said, the ratio between officers and enlisted personnel in Brazilian contingents is larger than what Brazilian Army doctrine suggests. Could this be a sign of over-reliance on officers in opposition to non-commissioned officers? Can you get that, Eduarda, please?
Yes, so I was trying to see if I understood it, but I'm afraid I don't have enough information to answer that one. I think it's actually an interesting question, but yeah, I think I would just take a note, and I will get back to him, whom I know, in order to answer that. Perhaps Mr. Werneck has something to add?
Just to my personal experience when I was deployed in MINUSTA, in the headquarters just after the earthquake, and we could actually compare the structure with the Brazilian battalion and other battalions. And yes, Brazil had some more senior officers deployed in some key positions within a battalion. And if you reflected the national structure to what they were deploying abroad, you would find usually a lieutenant colonel commanding a unit at the battalion level, and maybe a major as a deputy commander. And when they deploy to peacekeeping operations, you probably might find two colonels, one as the commander and the other one as a deputy commander. But I think that's because Brazil was trying to make sure that experienced and matured officers with command experience were being deployed. So it's not that you're deploying for the first time as a commander in a peacekeeping operation. So in terms to have effective performance and a better outcome, more experienced personnel were being sent abroad, and that experience was from the national professional career. So that's why you find sometimes people at different rank, at higher ranks than what the doctrine prescribes. That's my personal impression.
Thank you. I have one question here for myself from Enrique Garbino, echoing Arturo Sotomayor's research on civil-military relations in troop-contributing countries. Troops returning to peacekeeping missions might challenge their role in their home countries. Bolsonaro's government assigned many reserve and active duty military officers with peacekeepers' background in political positions. Do you think those two things are somehow linked? Well, I think we need to make a distinction here between troops returning and these officers that are generals and now are taking part in the government. So I think even before MINUSTA, troops, Brazilian military troops, had a different relation or civil military relations than what we expect in the global north. And that's an important study to be made here about this perception of civil military relations and even the troops, their own perceptions. And of course, yes, it will have an impact of these troops when they return from these missions. Again, talking about troops. Let's not forget historical elements of that too. Troops that participate in the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in Italy during the Second World War, they also challenged their role when they came back to the country, troops. Regarding the active duty military officers that are with peacekeeping background in the political positions, one thing that we should look more in details, and again, I haven't done that, it's to see how many generals today or colonels or lieutenant colonels in Brazilian army are veterans of Haiti. I guess that's a quite huge number. We are talking about 13 years with rotation of troops every 6 months. So the amount of those officers that are veterans from Haiti, from the MINUSTA, it's a huge number. So consequently, if we are looking today to the high staff of the armed force, basically almost everyone will be with a background in peacekeeping operation. So that's an important element to take into consideration here. I don't know if Bolsonaro called them because of their peacekeeping experience, or because, well, everyone had a peacekeeping experience. So if they call someone to any political role, it will come someone with peacekeeping experience. So that's an important element to look here. And I think it's still, we are still in the middle of the hurricane to try to make some sense what the experience in peacekeeping operation had or not influenced in their political actions when they are executing these roles as politicians. So I would not discuss these elements in this or any sort of judgmental aspect. I'm just thinking that Brazilian military leadership or top senior roles, especially in the army, they mostly will have peacekeeping experience. I don't have statistically, probably Eduardo has more details about that, but I think the generals today, I would count very few that haven't been to a peacekeeping operation. Eduardo, would you like to add something here?
No, I think you're right in a way. I had that research from last year, but it's out of date now. I need to catch it up. And actually, we did not only level 1, but also levels 2 and 3 to see whether there were veterans from UN missions in other levels of the executive. But one thing that I'm thinking about is that you actually don't really have veterans in the highest level of the UN Army, except for 1 or 2 out of 16, or with huge experience. So that might explain why we're not, as Antonio mentioned here, we're not really leading as an institution a new peacekeeping force or mission. But just to get this and answer Antonio, this is a guess, of course, right? But I just wanted to share some news. Some of you might know, others might perhaps don't know yet. But since December, late November, or early December, the Army started to train. The Secopab, the Peacekeeping Training Center, started to train again troops from the south, from Santa Catarina, Paraná. I think, or Paraná, Rio Grande do Sul, I mean from the south, to become a future battalion or eventually a company to be deployed probably into 2022. It will depend, of course, on a lot of decisions, but if it is decided, the troop will be ready. That's the argument. If it is accepted, if the UN has space, if the president decides, if Congress approves, if the Ministry of Economy has money, then the troop will be ready. This is one thing. So I think things might be changing. The second thing that I'd like to share with Antonio and others is that Brazil is in the middle of a campaign for a non-permanent seat of the Security Council. It was just, the Itamaraty just launched a video last week, and it will be voted in June of this year. And if elected, which is highly probable, but not, we don't know, of course, it depends on an election, but all the time, every time Brazil presented the candidacy, it was elected. So it's possible, it will probably see Brazil in the UN Security Council from January 2022 until December 2023. That would also put Brazil in the middle of the stage, the focus of a spotlight. And the other times where Brazil deployed troops in our history throughout these 70 years, we were actually in the Security Council, or we had just left the Security Council. So there is this coincidence or not, that will put at least more pressure for Brazil, for the army or the other armed forces, especially the army, to go back to the stage, to the arena, in this sense. So they're getting ready for it in terms of troops, and the campaign is going on in terms of exceeding the non-permanent seat for the Security Council. So I see better winds coming for 2022.
May I make a comment, Vinicius?
Please go ahead.
And Eduardo has heard this before. It's not the decision to deploy troops to a peacekeeping operations is not a unilateral decision. It's not something that a country says, okay, I'm going to get everything ready and now my troops are going to deploy, right? So we have also to see the trends in peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is a bit of a cycle. We had a huge increase of numbers in 2013-14 with the deployment of MINUSMA and MINUSCA. But later, after that, we saw the end of the mission Liberia, Ivory Coast, Haiti, and now Darfur. So we are on a down spiral, right? We're going down. The fact of the matter is we changed the way we force generate troops. We now keep a peacekeeping capability readiness system where member states, they receive our communications in terms of trends, what we're gonna need in the future. And we start this process of preparation of units in a strategic approach much before a requirement emerges from a mission. So I manage this system. So if I go there today, I'll tell you member states that are ready to deploy their full battalions in 60 days. Those units have been inspected, they are trained, they have the equipment, so they're ready to go, right? They are at the starting line, the pole position for deployment. So the fact that Brazil takes a very long decision-making process, the cycle is too extensive, this is a challenge for the country. Because now we have, with the enlargement of the pool of contributors, we have options. The UN needs these units to be deployed within a certain timeline, right? So it's important that Brazil keeps these troops at a high readiness and preparedness level for deployment, and we create a mechanism to be able to make a decision within the UN timelines. Because if we don't do it, the UN will approach a different country. So that is one of the things. I would like also to, if I can, hear some of the questions that are being put. I do not have any views or perspective on how the president selected the ministers or former generals or active duty generals to be in government positions, so I will not make any comment on that. I did see a comment from Oscar Castillo, probably for Eduardo, but if I can answer about communication and impact on leadership. And the UN has something called the Contingent Owned Equipment Framework, right? And under that framework, you have something called the self-sustainment. Self-sustainment are services that provide to a unit an expeditionary capability. We're deploying units from Brazil in the middle of somewhere. They need to be able to cook, they need to be able to lodge, they need to have firefighting capabilities. There are several services that are approved by member states with the standards, right? And one of them is welfare. So welfare is a responsibility of the member state. Another thing that, and I can tell you by the latest deployment we had in Haiti, Brazil had a very good infrastructure for everything that we're talking about: internet connection, communication with families, gym, sports, and everything. Brazil really takes care of its soldiers. And another thing that the country does is that the UN has a 1-year cycle of deployment. So a soldier, when deploys, they deploy for 1 year with 30 days leave. Brazil always kept a 6 months rotation period, giving 15 days leave for the soldiers, right? So we were responsible for our own rotation. The UN would pay for one at every cycle, but the middle one, Brazil was the one doing it. And that has some very positive points, some negative points as well, because the moment you're starting to learn the environment, it's time to go home. But at the same time, that gives you a ability to keep a operational tempo that if a country is going for a 1 year, they're not going to keep the same tempo. So our ability to keep the rhythm of operations is much higher than some others that were there for a year. They say, I'll take it easy, I'll pace myself, and I don't want to get too exhausted in the first 2 months, right? So,
yeah, thank you for addressing this issue. Eduardo, would you like to add something else about this question of welfare?
Yeah, sure. I'll just try to complement that with some recent research that I'm doing parallel to this hat of peacekeeping. I'm also doing some research on the military family. And there's this new program, well, new, it's been 5 years, 2016, it was launched by the Army at least, to support the families of military and civil servants that would go on special missions. And so there's a series of what can be a special mission, and the welcome operation, for example, in Roraima is considered a special mission. A peacekeeping mission is considered a special mission. And basically they give support to the family while the military or the civil servant is away. So they has a psychological service. They call the wife or the husband. Usually it's a man deployed, so they call the wife. They check on the school of the kids, and they check if the neighbors are aware of the situation of that family, and they check on the wife every now and then. There's this even this is activity to engage the whole family before the deployment. I even heard, I had an interview with one of them, and she said she wrote a letter for him that he would receive 2 months later, and that was too emotional, and but that engaged the whole family in that process of being without the person. That would also bring some peace of mind to the military who is away, that he would more or less know that at least there's a safety network taking care of his family while he's there. So even if these connections won't work, usually they work, but sometimes they won't, or so on and so forth, you do have some kind of network from the Army, and also the neighbors. They have some kind of a godfather and a godmother system that you would nominate to take care of the family and so on. So these little issues would at least try to minimize some emotional impacts that may affect leadership.
Okay, we have a question by Kevin Fleming. Kevin, thanks again for joining us today. Kevin is a good friend of Brazil Institute and probably very familiar to many that worked in Brazil in the military field recently. And Kevin asked, Ivo mentioned one of the defining leadership characteristics looked for by the UN when selecting leaders are norm-based. Eduardo mentioned green training. These are both very culturally driven and depend very much on the nation that the leader comes from. Is this perhaps why Brazil has successfully contributed so many force commanders over the recent years, because the Brazilian norms and green training is congruent with the UN views on how leaders should behave? To what extent can the UN defined norms-based leadership characteristics be used to fairly decide which leaders to select?
If I may, just when I mentioned the norm-based, is that the UN will request everyone that is part of the UN, either as a seconded officer or deploying as part of its contingents, to follow the norms of the UN, right? So you have to put aside your national norms and follow the UN norms. That's the standardized approach, standardized characteristics. And on the selection of leadership, one of the things that is done, we verify if the person who is a candidate for that position, they understand what the UN norms are, the rules, if they have any experience with the UN. And even before deploying, these people go through an induction program where besides the mandatory training, the pre-deployment training, some senior posts, they come to New York to understand better how these rules and regulations of the UN would apply to the posts that they are there, right? The green training that Eduardo mentioned is something that we also are now being more careful, especially for contingents, right? So now we have something called the Military Performance Evaluation Task Force, that when we do a pre-deployment training, and our colleagues from the blue train, they go and verify if you taught protection of civilians, the structure of the UN, gender, human rights, all the blue side, they all go and see if you're able to conduct the tasks of that unit based on the standards that we have on the military manuals. So the basis of having a good soldier. If you're not a good soldier, if you don't have a good soldiering skills, you can have the best blue training ever, and you're not going to be a good peacekeeper. So the UN is trying to look at those both, but understanding that is a national responsibility. Training, the UN only provides, it's a GA decision. The UN provides the standards, the documents, the material, but the conduct of the training is a national responsibility. Eduardo, thank you.
Thank you. No, I think there is an alignment of values, of Western values, if you want, and in many sense, and there are several values behind it. You could think of not just the big ones like multilateralism, human rights to many extent, and so on and so forth, but also some different that would require the comparative research, why Brazil is so successful and other Western countries are not, especially countries from South America or Latin America, but why they would not be able to fill in so many positions. I wouldn't have a direct answer to that. So, but I guess I would start by thinking that, yes, they share Western values. Yeah, but then that doesn't have the whole picture. You would have to see why others won't get through the same path, while Brazil does. We need more research. We do need a new research agenda on leadership in UN peace operations in Brazil.
I also would add, perhaps to this point, what we could call a synergic effect. And what I'm calling synergic effect is, as much Brazil participate in peacekeeping operation, as much this green training changed also in Brazil, and also changed the even peacekeeping practices in some way. It's difficult to see where this thing started, but I think this 13 years of troops contribution to Haiti, to the MINUSTA in Haiti, helped a lot to the Brazilian armed forces, and especially the army, to understand what was expected in a peacekeeping like that. The aspect of the 6-month rotation, the aspect of transformation of that experience in lessons learned that were deeply embedded in the training with the Joint Center for Peacekeeping Training in Rio, and that becoming a sort of a mutual process of transformation that probably has an impact important here to be looked at. I know that many other countries in South America have also their Center for Peacekeeping, and they have their doctrine, absorbing doctrine from the experience as lessons learned things. But apparently, Brazil managed to do that in a way that incorporate even the understanding of what means a green training for these peacekeepers. Well, we have another question here. Lieutenant General Goulart, former member of OMA DPKO and Force Commander MINUSTA. General, thanks for joining us here. It's a pleasure to have someone with your experience in the audience too. My question is, he says, the fact that Brazil has a recent history of a relevant contribution to UN military leadership is, in the view of the PKO, a positive or negative factor for Brazil to receive more leadership positions? Second question, how relevant is in reality the fact that Brazil has no troops currently committed to UN for the country's interest in getting leadership posts in the PKO and field missions?
General, nice talking to you, sir. It's a pleasure. Thank you for your question. And I will answer the first question, but also making a link to your second question. We have to remember that people move a lot, right? People in the UN, they move, and when they move, they forget. So although we have a very good recent history and performance, we got to keep this momentum, right? So that's why we had, since General Santos Cruz was the force commander in MONUSCO, we have been invited also to provide candidates. And this is happening now as we approach the end of General Costa Neves' term as force commander MONUSCO. We will be invited to take part of selection process. But I can assure you that some countries that have troops on the ground will come and will say, why are we giving this post to a country that doesn't have troops? And as an example, we had the Maritime Task Force, we had the flagship until December this year. The position of the Maritime Task Force commander has been shifted from Brazil to Germany, because we don't have ships on the task force anymore. So yes, it plays a very important role on having troops. It's not a mandatory decision factor, but the fact that troops, that countries that have troops on the ground, they want to have these positions. So they will do all the political lobby. They will try to convince leadership that these posts should be allocated to them. So that is a reality. It is a relevant criteria. It's not a mandatory criteria. But as I mentioned before, if you go in MONUSCO, sometimes you have countries that have 4 or 5 infantry battalions and they all want to have the post. And the USG is in a bad position. So they bring an outsider like Brazil and he pacifies the dispute between the internal TCCs with an outsider. But that's not a very common procedure. As what happened in Brazil in MINUSTA, it's not common that a single member state stays with the force commander position for the entire duration of the mission. I think the only place that I have seen this was in MINUSTA. Please let me know if I answered your questions. If not, I'll be happy to readdress. Thank you.
Eduardo, would you like to add something here?
No, I would just emphasize what Ivo said. I mean, it is true that no other mission had one single force commander for one single nationality throughout its lifetime. So this is the data. So yeah, definitely. What I tend to say, and it's a difficult thing perhaps for the UN to hear, but as a Brazilian national, as a patriot that I am, etc., I'd rather see us in strategic positions with or without troops, and to compare ourselves to key member states that provide strategic advice or provide ideas for doctrine or for new trainings, etc. These are, for example, Canada, Sweden, Norway, the UK, the US, France. On the other side, you have member states that are more like playing by the rules that are given by those first countries. So my question is always, where should we stay? Should we, it's just some provocation. And I know the UN is probably a bit...
Let me just put a different view here. I think we should find a balance because, for example, countries that Eduardo mentioned, Sweden has a long-range patrol company deployed in MINUSMA. The UK had an engineering company deployed in South Sudan. Now they have a recce company deployed in MINUSMA. Canada had a helicopter unit deployed in MINUSMA until last year, and now they have a regional C-130 in Entebbe for services. Norway has a C-130 deployed to MINUSMA. Portugal has a quick reaction force company in MINUSCA and a C-130 in MINUSMA. So these countries, they do that in targeted units that bring high-end capabilities that are decisive for the overall mission accomplishment. That gives them experience to go in these forums of training, of doctrine, and say, look, based on my experience, what is funny is that sometimes we had, for example, Brazil was leading the review of the aviation manual for the UN, right? We have never deployed an aviation unit to the United Nations. So how do you bring credibility to your opinions if you have not been on the ground and doing it yourself? But we have to find a balance, but not having any troops at all, for me, that is a problem that we have to understand and navigate based on the country's objective, desires, and decisions.
I think,
yeah.
Sorry, Eduardo.
No, but based on these latest reports that the army is already training, a future battalion that would eventually become autonomous as an autonomous company or even a smaller troop, a platoon, whatever. That gives us hope that Brazil might understand this new way of working with the UN system and might go back to the scene as I mentioned. I am hopeful. I am, I'm full of hope for next year.
And I would add to that and seconding what Ivo said, the aspect of the chirurgical positioning is not only in quantity. I think we have this tendency also in Brazil of superlativity. So we need to be the biggest contribution, the longest So I think if we start to look at this issue of peacekeeping operation in a more strategic and chirurgical way, we don't need to send a lot of people, but to especially specific points, and not necessarily even as troops. No, recently, Brazil deployed a team from the Jungle Training Center to support the training of some troops in MONUSCO. That's probably not so relevant, but it is relevant in the sense that it is a strategic deployment, and it has impact that's long duration. It's not simply a presence there for a couple of months, but it inseminate ideas and doctrines that will incorporate the main core doctrine of peacekeeping operation in the United Nations. So I think that's an important aspect that we should be looking as Brazilians and those in Brazil responsible for preparation of these troops or preparation of the deployment of a military, is how to be strategic in these choices and how to be chirurgical in the execution of these deployments. Thanks again, General, for your question. We will move to the next one, Juliana Grafunda. I would like to address a question to both Mr. Werneck and Professor Hamann. As we saw in the presentation, many Brazilian military officers were deployed in leadership positions in peace missions, but at the same time, many of them, when came back to Brazil, are in charge of severe positions in Bolsonaro's government at this moment. So what's the role of civil-military relations regarding the military officers after they were deployed to a UNPO post and come back to their home countries?
Again, I'm not sure why or the criteria that the president used to select the members of his cabinet, but I won't address that. But this is based on national structures. I heard from one colleague once that usually countries have an army. Some countries, the army has a country. So it all depends on the national dynamics and national politics. What we are always worried about is that troops that we deploy, we make sure that they go through human rights vetting, no allegations are done, no involvement in any criminal activities. That's all vetted by our human rights branch. But also sometimes we are careful when troops are going back home if the country is going through a problem, right? So we are also worried about the return of these troops back home. Things have changed since they have deployed, but I couldn't ascertain to all countries what is their role when they go back. Usually they go back to their families, they go back to their regular lives, and they keep on progressing on their careers. That's the norm, right? Thank you.
Yeah, probably would add also that in this context, in this current context, they are not in the army anymore. Those that are called to government roles, and even some of them started and left these governmental roles after. So I don't think we could make a directly correlation here again between be a leader in peacekeeping operation in returning, executing leadership position in the country, because can be a coincidence.
Yeah, I was just going to add that when you are in a leading position, and Gerald Goulart is here and he can testify on that if he's comfortable with that. But then you are in the middle of a multidimensional space. You're not just looking down to your troops. You're looking to your peers who are civilians, who are authorities of another country, who are, you have to report to the UN Security Council, you have to deal with diplomats, you have to deal with national authorities, you have to deal with NGOs, you have to deal with a wide group of different institutions and people and demands. I guess an anthropological research would be interesting in terms of understanding how people who would wear the blue helmet would come home differently if you compare with those who only wear the green helmet. And I'm not only talking about blue training, I'm talking about a blue experience, especially in these leading positions. And I'm also thinking now about the welcome operation and how those who lead it also have to deal with a wide range of situations that go much beyond simply leading troops. So it's totally different than leading troops in a war period. Right? That's my opinion. And again, I would just say what Vinicius just said. I mean, it's just not the army. It's not an institutional presence. It's actually individual people who are populating some leading positions in the government. So it's a difficult situation, actually. But I do think they might have acquired some skills and even some values, if you want, that would allow them to look wider than those who have not had an experience with the blue helmet.
Okay, Kevin made a comment about that here, and we can all read there in the Q&A session. Thanks, Kevin, for adding that. It's also important to remember that when for instance, a commander of a battalion for Brabat was selected, he was already an experienced senior officer. Some of them have had a previous experience as peacekeeper in Haiti or even in other missions before. They were well qualified as officers. They were selected to command a battalion abroad. And consequently, that would add just more qualifications for the possibility for this officer to become a general, as it happening in many situations. So I just want to highlight, it's not because they went to Haiti that they were promoted to general, but it was consequent of a career that also culminated that point there. No? Yeah, we have another question from Enrique. We are over the time. I'm really sorry. I'm a terrible moderator when I'm also talking and moderating at the same time. But I think we have a last question here from Enrique Garbino to Ivo, and probably could do that. Returning to the idea of relational leadership, how does the relationship between the senior leadership team feeds into the selection process of individual senior leaders? For example, would the UN seek complementary in gender, national backgrounds, etc.? Ivo, that's for you.
Well, thank you for that question. And again, the UN tried to have a diverse representation everywhere, right? So having a regional balance is one of the targets. That brings credibility. That shows that the international community is present, trying to solve a local problem, right? So it is a domino effect. It's very unlikely that you will have the SRSG, the DSRSGs, and the force commander and the police commissioner from the same nationality, from the same region. You try to bring the balance, but you have to take in consideration, besides gender, which is one of the things we're looking to, is competency. All of these people who are interviewed, who are selected, they have to be competent for that post, right? And the UN has something also called a competency-based interview, which is a behavior interview. So you select people that you understand that will fit into that environment, that understand the nature of the relationships within the UN. So yes, I think that they are complementary. They're not mandatory to be like that, but the UN tries to bring a balance, tries to bring diversity, try not only by gender, but also by the location, backgrounds. So it is very unlikely that you will have everyone coming from the same region, because that doesn't bring any benefit. And the diverse points of view, also they add for a better result. So the UN works a lot on consensus. The decision-making process in the UN is not like we have in the military. It's trying to bring people on board with the same platform, bringing consensus to move on their actions, to implement their plans. Sometimes it takes longer to achieve or to reach that point, but that's one of the principles. Is a more horizontal structure, although the responsibilities and accountabilities are present. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we ran out of time, really. And just to conclude, a very short final words here. I would like, first of all, to thank our audience for joining this event, to participate actively with your questions and comments. I would like to thank very much Professor Funmi Olonisakin, that is not here with us, but took the time to record that video and send us some ideas that inseminate our discussion here. Thanks especially for our two guests, Ivo from New York, and Eduardo from Brasilia nowadays, I think, for taking their time also to participate in this debate. As I mentioned, we are very proud in Brazil Institute of this partnership with REBRAPAZ. I can see that this first event, it's a good sign that we still have a lot to work together and a lot of contributions from the academic perspective to this discussion of Brazilian peacekeeping operation. And I think we have a fantastic momentum for exactly bring this discussion, because it's exactly this point when we will be seeing how much and how will be this Brazilian engagement with current and future peacekeeping operations. That's a big challenge for the country, of course, but we can see also that, as we said, from the military point of view, from the academic point of view, and from the diplomatic point of view, there are many efforts that have been put in order to make Brazil an important contributor to the structure of UN peacekeeping operations, and to be a topic discussed when we bring the issue of peacekeeping again to the table. So thank you so much for all of you for your participation. This session was recorded, and in 1 week or more, it will be available in the YouTube page of King's College London, and we will be linked that to our web page also. Eduarda, you have some words also to say, I imagine.
Just to thank you for the partnership. But before I do the institutional part, I just wanted to say that I received an information from my military advisor to answer the first question raised by Henrique Garbino. I don't know if Henrique is still online. Just to say that he was asking about the size, the amount of officers in a peacekeeping mission in the Brazilian battalion. And what I received here is that the organization of a battalion for peace force is more complete than that of those regular battalions in times of peace. And it has a lot more officers in functions that do not exist, such as interpreters, legal advisors, CIMIC officers, and so on. It also has a lot of supporting roles for staff officers and sub-commanders of subunit that you don't find in moments of peace. So just wanted to finalize by answering the first question, because I didn't have the information by then, and now I do. So it's everyone can receive this answer as well. And now I thank you, Vinicius, for the opportunity of joining forces with the Brazil Institute of what is the first of a series of events on peacekeeping and Brazil, and to seize this momentum that you mentioned that we have in front of us in 2021 to prepare the country to reapproach and to get back to the stage in 2022, hopefully. With or without troops.
Thanks.
With troops, hopefully.
Yeah. Thanks again, Ivo and Eduarda, and all of you for joining us for this Brazil Week. And as I say, stay tuned for our next events, both with the partnership between REBRAPAZ and Brazil Institute, and also for our Brazil Week. Tomorrow we still have some events on, so look at our page, and if you can join us, it will be a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you, and from someone in London, good evening, good afternoon. I don't think we have any good morning around us, but thanks again. Bye-bye.